The motto for the center is, "No one's invincible, it's time he has a place for him and the people in his life." That's the slogan for this new institution, which we opened in the fall of 2014, called the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in downtown Toronto. And the way I describe the long-term vision of the center is it's to catalyze a fundamental change in the relationship between men and masculinity on the one hand, and society and its institutions on the other. My belief is that men and society have to meet halfway if we're to make truly fundamental changes that can build stronger families and healthier communities. So let me start with men. I think men need to change. Men need to learn that it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay to need support, it's okay to ask for help. And society, for its part, needs to learn to expect men to ask for help and not to trivialize those needs as unimportant or as secondary, or to dismiss them under the old notion that men are the cause of all of our problems and so not worthy of concern. I think we need to get both sides, men and society, to come together or progress will be elusive. I'm going to give you a few examples of men's issues areas, and you can see how this dynamic plays out in each one. So these are going to be men's health, fathers and children, boys' education, and domestic violence. So let's start with men's health. It's the most basic concern for us at the center. Men are less likely than women to seek out help for their healthcare needs. In a provocative June 2011 article for the American Psychological Association, which was entitled "Why Men Die Earlier" by health journalist Bridget Murray Law, she explained that men are 25% less likely to have visited a healthcare provider in the past year and almost 40% more likely to skip recommended cholesterol screenings, for example. The tragic results speak for themselves. Men are 1.5 times more likely to die from heart disease, cancer, and respiratory disease, and men die on average 5 years earlier than women. Now, while male susceptibility to an earlier death is often sort of waved away or dismissed as due to genetics alone, it turns out most of the effect, or at least much of the effect, may be related instead to behavior. So I'm speaking now of research done by Gilles Tremblay, a social work professor at Laval University in Quebec City, who argues that 1 year difference might be biological. The rest, in his opinion, is cultural. His work suggests that it's socialized masculinity, the traits of socialized masculinity, traits like emotional suppression, aggression, risk-taking, all of which lead to fewer healthcare visits and higher rates of injury and disease. Ronald Levant, a former president of the American Psychological Association, is even more blunt. He says, quote, "Masculine gender socialization is hazardous for men's health, posing a double whammy of poorer health behaviors and lower use of health care." Now, it's already fairly established that men are significantly more likely to die of so-called preventable deaths, these being suicide deaths, which are 75% men, workplace suicides, 94% men. Men are 81% of war deaths, and of those who die on the job, 93% are men. Of those who die at the hands of another, homicide, 77% are men. And so behind those shocking numbers, much can be attributed to male socialization. Now, I think we're learning that male behavioral factors may account for more than just these so-called preventable deaths, and that a broad range of general negative health outcomes may be avoidable if men cared more about their own well-being. That's kind of tragic to consider, but I think it at least signals hope, because behavior we can change, genetics is a lot harder to change. One way to change men's willingness to seek out help is to challenge and ultimately redefine the perception of what it means to be strong. You know, often men see strength in the avoidance of help, in toughening it out and being stoic, but we can redefine strength. If men think that it's difficult to get help, if they think it's difficult to go to the doctor and signal that they need help, if they find that that's something that's difficult for them to do, then maybe there's a new kind of strength in doing what's difficult, despite how difficult it is. But when men do reach out for help, they need to find a receptive set of institutions. So this is the other side of that dilemma. Because there are far fewer healthcare agencies dedicated to men. If you search, as I did, for registered Canadian charities with both a gender and a healthcare focus, you'll find 13 for women, 1 for men. If you visit Toronto 211, which provides a comprehensive list of services available in Toronto, you'll find 27 entries when you search men's health. Women's health, you'll get 92 entries. So I called Toronto 211. I asked for their men's health listing. All they provided me with were contacts for non-gender specific sex clinics. I also checked into the Toronto Community Care Access Health Line, which is set up to refer residents to healthcare services in their neighborhood. There I found a page listing 24 agencies dedicated to women's health under the heading Women's Healthcare Centers, all of them in just one region of Toronto. There was no page for men's healthcare, so I called their office and what they told me was, quote, they've never seen a men's healthcare center listed. The only health-related services dedicated to men were, again, private clinics treating sexual dysfunctions. Now those are important, but women had available agencies to help with everything from life skills to eating disorders. Now the lack of support for male victims of eating disorders is instructive, so I'll take that as one example. 1/3 of those diagnosed with eating disorders are actually men, and yet eating disorders and body image disorders are still overwhelmingly seen as a women's health issue. Within the last couple of years, a Toronto social service agency dedicated to eating disorders called Sheena's Place actually launched a men's pilot program in order to sort of rebrand and attract more men. It turns out, and they had a conversation with me about this as they were looking for ways of attracting more men, that in 15 years of doing splendid work, they'd only gotten 2 men to walk through the door in 15 years. So that's a great example of trying to meet men halfway. Now, a small institution like the Canadian Centre for Men and Families obviously can't make up for the lack of programs for men, but our goal is to serve as a hub, as a catalyst, both to change social attitudes as well as to change men and the way that they approach social institutions. And we aim to work with agencies like Sheena's Place to better engage with men. Skip ahead a little bit here. So that's men's health, which I think is the most obvious, but it's not the only area where there exists this kind of chasm between men and society. Another, I'd argue, is the domain of fatherhood and specifically the father-child bond. Because children are often the biggest casualty following the breakdown of a family. And one of the most common ways in which children suffer is through something called parental alienation. What is parental alienation? Well, it's a form of emotional child abuse, where a custodial parent belittles or even vilifies the other parent to the child. While both the mother and the father are capable of committing alienation, let's be fair about that, children are significantly more likely to have the bond with their father compromised or even broken, simply because they're less likely to find their father being the custodial parent. Now, in the extreme case where a child actually loses contact and a relationship altogether with his or her father, the consequences of fatherlessness can be severe. Now here I just want to be clear, single mothers perform heroic work, and many are forced to raise children on their own. But the research is clear. Even controlled for socioeconomic factors, growing up fatherless is correlated to higher rates of suicide, teen pregnancy, behavioral disorders, incarceration, and high school dropout rates. Now the tragedy here is that fathers, in many of these cases, desperately want to be part of the child's life. And in most of these cases, these are competent, loving parents. Yet society seems stuck with this outdated and sexist notion of the deadbeat dad. Family courts will routinely limit a child's access to his or her father, and even look the other way when a child is purposefully kept away from seeing their dad. These fathers need to take action for the sake of their children. They need to report parental alienation to family courts and to the Children's Aid Society. They need to lobby for something called the presumption of equal shared parenting following family breakup. Now, many are quick to dismiss parental alienation and this reform agenda because it might make mothers look bad, or out of this really, I think, offensive belief that men fake a desire to be with their kids merely as a means of controlling their ex-spouses. But these are exactly the kinds of old-fashioned beliefs that keep men's issues trivialized and safely out of the way. It's actually not helping men or women, for that matter. It's why every province in this country has a special agency to enforce payment of child support, but none of the provinces have a program to enforce custody access. So much for fatherhood. Let's talk now about the so-called boys' crisis, which relates to the educational underachievement of young males in our schools. In 2010, the Globe and Mail ran a 6-part series looking at the boys' crisis, demonstrating that boys rank behind girls by nearly every measure of scholastic achievement. Boys earn lower grades, they trail in reading and writing, they're more likely to be picked out for behavioral problems, they're more likely to repeat a grade and to drop out of school altogether. These trends have been studied extensively by Dr. Paul Caplan of the Canadian Council on Learning. He published a report in January 2011 with some of his findings. What he argued, basically, was that looking at the whole world, female access to education is, of course, an important focus in developing countries. But in developed countries, we also need to do more to adequately address this gap in boys' literacy and learning rates overall. And here again, I think the dilemma really, there's two horns of this dilemma. There's men, and then there's society once again. Boys need to learn to change their attitudes towards learning. Boys are socialized, in some cases, to perceive reading and education as girl activities. And boys must take the initiative to reorient themselves to appreciate the importance, utility, and the pleasure of reading. And teachers must meet them halfway. Teachers need to increase their expectations of boys, find unique ways to raise their self-confidence, their motivation, and their interest in reading and learning. Now, we've been making some progress on this. The Ontario Ministry of Education and OISE, the School of Education at U of T, has started a project called the Boys Literacy Teacher Inquiry Project, which is trying to understand this problem and develop resources so that teachers can do a better job of educating boys. But there's a lot of work to do. Most of the focus has really been on reading and literacy, and for good reasons. That needs to be a big priority. But the issues, the gaps in learning overall still need to be addressed. And there has been even far less attention paid to post-secondary education, where the enrollment gaps between boys and girls has been widening now for years. And then after education, of course, we try to find a job. So let's talk a little bit about employment and that transition to the workforce. Because I think here what we have is it's a missed opportunity for gender equality. I think we should work to break down gender stereotypes that still lead to professions that are dominated either by men or in some cases by women. We should recruit, for example, and mentor men who are interested in traditionally female jobs, like nursing, like teaching, like early childhood education. There's a couple of groups actually trying to do this, and I applaud them. One is the Calgary-based Nursing Guys Club. There's also a group in Toronto that I've met with called the Men in Nursing Interest Group, which is registered with which is part of the Registered Nurses Association of Ontario. Now, they were set up because, in their opinion, they had found that men going into nursing were facing certain stigmas. According to a study that they used to back up this belief in the American Journal of Men's Health, male nurses are viewed as, quote, less masculine, and 33% more male nurses claim to have been physically assaulted by a patient. Now, if you think the low male representation in nursing is a problem, let's talk about early childhood education. So there was an article back in 2013 in the Toronto Star, and they were exploring this, and I credit them for doing that. Did you know that in both the public, secular, and the Catholic school systems combined, there are 755 early childhood educators in the Toronto systems? 755. You know how many are male? Anybody want to guess?
35?
3.
More than 3, less than 35.
20.
22. Very good.
Oh man, you always go with the new guy.
22 out of 735. So there was this article, as I mentioned, and it was called Men Stand Out as Daycare Workers. They interviewed Julia Littman. She's, I guess, the spokesperson from the College of Early Childhood Educators. Now, this to me was interesting. She said, since the college's inception in 2008, the number of new members, these would be budding early childhood educators, who identify themselves as male has consistently been approximately 1%. And then she went on to say, we are focused on the public interest and professionalism, and we do not take gender into account, although it is an interesting question. Of course, in fields ranging from engineering to the physical sciences, aggressive efforts have long been underway to recruit women into those professions, and these are absolutely necessary and praiseworthy initiatives. But I think that there should also be recruitment and mentorship efforts similarly to get men into nursing, into teaching, into childhood education, where I think society would be well served to have more men. Police departments, as an example, take great pains in their hiring process to ensure that their police departments represent the community, look like the community. We hear that a lot. Now, given the influence of early childhood educators and teachers in the lives of young children, and given the frequent lack of male role models in the home, is it not at least as important that these professions also represent our community? Yet, Dr. Rebecca Coulter and Dr. Margaret McNay, both at Western University, not too far from here, found that men face suspicion, that was their word, suspicion, from both parents and fellow educators when they show an interest in professions that involve them with young children. Another example of social attitudes that need to change. Now, the final area I want to touch on is domestic violence, or sometimes called intimate partner violence. There's a study, actually there's been many studies, but the most recent one in 2009 by Statistics Canada, called the Family Violence in Canada Profile, found that 7% of women and 6% of men surveyed had encountered some form of spousal violence over the previous 5 years. That was the question that they asked. In other words, the rates of violence are unacceptably high for men and women. This is a problem that we need to address. But the point is, victims of violence come in all ages, all races, all ethnicities. We know that. But they also come in all sexual orientations. We know that there's violence in same-sex relationships, just as there is in opposite-sex relationships, and domestic violence even comes in all genders. And I think we should be concerned for all those who need help, even if the person looks different from what the stereotype of the victim is. Erin Pizzey, some of you may have heard of her, she founded the world's first shelter for battered women back in the UK in 1971. She found that of the, and this is quoting from her book here, of the first 100 women who came into my refuge, this is her words here, 62 of those 100 were as violent or more violent as the men that they were leaving. She said this is not a gender issue, and that the result of seeing it that way is that we refuse to see domestic violence as a human issue. We insist on seeing it instead as a political issue. Now, here's the problem specifically back in Toronto, where I hail from. If you visit the domestic violence website for the Toronto Police, the first thing you read at the top is women who have been victimized by violence are a Toronto Police Service priority. No mention on that page that men can even be victims. I believe the website and the focus should be that all victims are a priority. Whether you're a man or you're a woman, the police should be there to serve you equally. It's not just the, and I should say, just as a little addendum, I don't want to go too overboard with this because it's early days, but we've started actually meeting with representatives from the Toronto Police Domestic Violence Unit. In fact, we had a meeting a couple weeks ago with the lady that runs the unit, and she is very interested in what we're doing and has actually invited us to be part of something they call the Domestic Violence Advisory Committee, which has a meeting later this month where we'll be networking and sort of making the case that we need more services for male victims, and also obviously promoting our own services because we're the only ones doing support services for male victims of domestic violence. So that's a really good step, and I really applaud them for that. However, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to make it clear that the police are there for you no matter who you are if you need their help. But it's also not the police, to be fair. It's also, for example, the lack of shelters and the lack of support services more generally. And the biggest problem is, yes, there are homeless shelters for homeless men, but obviously they're not domestic violence shelters. They don't have trauma counseling. They don't have the other support services. We know, we've visited many of them, done a lot of research into this, that those services aren't there. But even worse is the fact that if you're a father who has children and you're trying to flee an abusive, violent mother, you really have no place that you can go. I don't think any homeless men shelters accept young children with a man. Maybe you're wrong about that. I know most of them don't. So there's a real limitation there. So just to sort of summarize my presentation up to this point, boys, men, and fathers, I think I'm trying to make the case here, are in crisis. And I'm not here simply to complain about problems and then order others to go off and fix them. My point is, we have built a facility. It's a modest space. It's called the Canadian Centre for Men and Families. We're actually trying to confront some of these issues. So let me tell you a little bit about what we do. We do counseling, we do peer support. We're trying to address the gap in men's mental health with those programs. We started an initiative called Fathering After Separation or Divorce, which is meant to put kids first. So it gives dads the tools to put the best interests of their children first and front and center. We run mentorship and leadership programs to empower boys, try to keep them in school. And next month, as I just alluded to, we're going to be working on trauma counseling, actually with a number of shelters, homeless men shelters in Toronto, where they will basically be a partner with us. So if there's a man who needs a shelter, he's fleeing violence, they do the shelter, we do the trauma and the other services. So that's a really, I think, I'm very pleased with that particular program. I think that's going to fill a big gap right now. And let me just kind of conclude, or at least move towards Kevin's portion of tonight, by talking a little bit about the values that I think really embody our organization. I think they embody Kevin's organization, the organization at U of T that Denise is part of. And I think they're why we've been making some headway in these areas. I think it's because of these values. So firstly, we're open, we're inclusive, and we're a safe space where we welcome everyone. From the moment we opened our doors, we were really inundated with calls for help from all sorts of people. And it should be clear, not just men. Roughly a third or so of the individuals that come to see us are women. Sometimes they're coming for services for themselves. Sometimes they're coming on behalf of male loved ones because the men face this stigma and they don't want to seek out help. So it's the women in their lives that bring them to us, and we think that's amazing. So I want to give you a few examples. We've had mothers calling us looking for educational resources for sons. We have had daughters visit us worried about their fathers who are dealing with depression or anxiety. We've had wives coming with husbands hoping to regain access to children from previous relationships, children that in some cases they haven't seen for years. Many of our clients are now being referred to us from hospitals, from shelters, from police agencies, from Children's Aid Society, and even also from women's organizations and women's shelters. The other value that we have is collaboration. So we work with many organizations. I'll just give you one example. In October, we hosted the first annual conference for male survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and all forms of trauma. It was a small, modest affair, as these things usually are when they start, but we're going to be having these every year. In fact, I just had a call this morning to talk about what next conference is going to look like, and we've got some amazing plans and keynote speakers for that particular conference. These are held, by the way, at Humber College, maybe a little bit easier to get to than downtown Toronto, so I'll keep you in the loop on that. And the reason I'm mentioning this is the partnerships that we built to make this happen include some of Canada's leading anti-violence charitable organizations, like the Canadian Centre for Abuse Awareness. It's been around for over 20 years, has helped thousands and thousands of people escape violence or work to prevent violence in their communities. Mostly it's a women's organization, but when we opened the center, one of the first calls I got from another social service agency was from Ellen Campbell, the amazing woman who's the CEO of the Centre for Abuse Awareness, saying finally there's a men's group that we can work with. So that was really nice to hear. The third value that I hope we embody is evidence-based research, and I'm sure that will strike a chord among this group. We hope, that our events and our research and our public policy campaigns are built around solid research. We have an advisory committee. It's filled with scientists, journalists, psychiatrists, social workers, professionals of all stripes. And I think that emphasis on scholarship and professionalism is one of the reasons why we were awarded charitable status in 2014. And I think we're one of only a small handful of men's issues focused, maybe the only one, educational charitable organizations. And the last value I'll mention is diversity, and I'd like to end with this. We've been working with individuals of every race, ethnicity, political viewpoint, gender identity, and sexual orientation. And what is often surprising to some folks is that women are involved in every aspect of this men's center. Women sit on our board of directors, women such as Paulette McDonald, who is a renowned authority and champion for family law reform. Women are members of our advisory committee, including Jasmine Newman, who runs workshops to help men develop better relationship skills and communication skills. Women are involved in running all of our programs. One of our most important facilitator is named Eleanor Levine. She's a member of the Faculty of Social Work at U of T. Several of our campus-based men's issues groups are even run by female students, if you believe it. We have Veronica Kay, a young woman who founded the University of Guelph Men's Issues Group because of her interest in suicide prevention. That's what she's looking into. And this is a nice segue to Ryerson and Kevin here. There were two young women who attempted to co-found a men's issues group at Ryerson University in 2013. They've been early 14 now. And it certainly seemed unacceptable to the Ryerson Student Union, the student government at Ryerson, which denied them ratification. And this is the ironic part, based on the belief that only groups that, quote, center women's voices should be allowed to discuss gender issues on campus. Now that is ironic because this group was to be run by and hence sort of center at least these two women's voices. So that was back in 2000, I think it was early 14, and then a couple of years later, along comes Kevin working with another diverse group of students trying again. And so here I toss it over to Kevin and ask him to bring us up to speed on how that effort's going.
Sure. Talk briefly about it. So yeah, I'm Kevin Arriola. I'm a fourth year politics student. So before I begin, I'd just like to thank the Halton-Peel Humanist Community for hosting this event, and Justin and Denise for inviting me to come speak to you all. I'd also like to say that I'm not an expert on anything. I'm a fourth year politics student, so I'm just finishing up my bachelor's. The only thing I really did to end up here was start a men's issues group at my university, and apparently this was controversial. So what is it about talking about men's issues that makes people get so weird? It seems to have such a polarizing effect on people. At least that's been my experience starting a men's issues group at Ryerson. When I first made the decision to start a group like this, I was met with a lot of support. Many people have approached me and expressed the support, which I appreciate. Some people have approached me with neutral skepticism. And these are my favorite people because they're usually open-minded enough to at least hear me out. And most of them are usually pretty supportive after they realize what we're trying to do. So that's great. And then of course there's a few that just want to give me a piece of their mind. I guess I should probably go into the reasons I started this group and let you make up your mind about it. I started this group because at my core I want to live in a world where equal rights and equity are guaranteed for all. I think that it's great that there are groups out there that look out for different groups' issues, groups that fight for women's rights, minority rights, and advancing the LGBTQ community. These are all things that I can get behind. I've always been the type of person that liked to get involved somehow, even in a small way, and this usually is done through a little bit of volunteering. So it was really this characteristic that made me get involved in something, but it was certain frustrations that made me get involved in men's issues and start a group like the Men's Issues Awareness Society at Ryerson. So these frustrations stemmed from what I perceived in our culture and in the media. I got sick of seeing time and time again men's issues being dragged through the mud. It seems like whenever men's issues are brought up, they're met with two reactions from most people. Either people are dismissive or they will outright mock them. Just to give you one example, in 2011, CBC's The Talk, which is a panel discussion program that explores the latest news headlines, did a segment on a disgusting case of domestic violence. In it, they described how a wife assaulted her husband after he filed for divorce. In the story, she cut off his penis and threw it in the garbage disposal. Now, I can't tell what I should have been more outraged about. The fact that there are people out there sick enough to do something like this, or the reaction from the panelists and the audience. Not only did they laugh and mock the victim, but they also proceeded to say that he probably deserved it. It just seems unimaginable to me that we can live in a world where mocking a victim is a knee-jerk response in a situation like this one. But that's what I've grown to expect when it comes to male victims, whenever they're brought up. Of course, that isn't the only example of societal apathy towards male victims. There's, of course, countless social experiments that I'm sure you can all find on YouTube of people's reactions to domestic violence. So in a situation where a man is seen abusing his wife, people around them are usually very quick to react and get involved. By contrast, the reactions to when it's a man being abused by a woman, the reaction is usually to not get involved and laugh at him. Now, granted, this is mainly due to how we as a society view men and women. So women are seen as weak and helpless, and men are generally seen as strong and capable. Ultimately, these ideas should be seen as both harmful to both men and women. As I've shown, it's not always a good thing to be seen as strong and capable, especially when you're a victim and need help. So while I applaud the work done by other organizations and other groups on a variety of different issues, it was the little attention and the social apathy towards issues affecting men and boys that ultimately made me get involved in this particular issue. It is my hope that all these groups can one day intersect and work together to create a positive society with social justice for all. Now, some might ask me why. They might say, if women are suffering more in the world, why bother helping men until we are finished helping women? And to that I say, equality and equity are not a zero-sum game. Now, some of you with a business background have probably heard this term, but for those of you that haven't, like me, a zero-sum game is a market where one's gains is measured by the losses of another. So helping women or helping men doesn't have to be at the expense of the other. I've also had people tell me that really I don't need to start a men's issues group because there are women's groups and feminist groups that are already working to solve gender equality for both men and women. To me, this argument stinks a little bit like baloney. From my experience learning about nonprofits in my program and working with them, the most effective organizations are the ones that can specialize. Some organizations try to take on more than they can chew and quickly find out that they don't have the bureaucratic capacity to make any sort of significant impact, especially if their scope is too wide. While it's true that by helping women we are also helping men, and vice versa, we need to recognize that the value of having groups that specialize towards we need to recognize the value of having groups that specialize towards certain demographics. It wasn't too long ago that women's groups were criticized for only looking out for the needs of white women. Eventually these groups split, and today we see women's groups of all types. There are groups for black women, Hispanic women, queer, lesbian, and trans women. The list goes on and on. If we thought back then that these groups weren't inclusive enough for just women, then you'd have to be smoking something pretty good to think that any women's group today would be sufficiently inclusive for men. To all the women's groups and the feminist groups that opened up this whole gender discussion, I would like to say thank you. Thank you for addressing some of the issues affecting men and boys in our society. We will always need you and your support going forward. That said, it's time that we handle our own issues our own way. Right now, it's difficult enough to make a men's issues group, but it is my hope that they one day become big enough to split and address different men's needs more efficiently, the way that many of these women's groups have. When I started my student group at Ryerson, I had a pretty simple vision. I wanted to get a discussion going about that would hopefully raise awareness about the issues that disproportionately affect men and boys in our society. I wanted as much diversity as possible, so that's what I did. Now our group has almost an equal representation of both men and women. It's almost split 50-50. Two of our other executives in the group are women. I'm the only man. Our group is also very multicultural, and we accept people of all sexualities and gender identities. But I think the greatest diversity we have is our diversity of ideas. We have socialists, conservatives, feminists, and non-feminists alike, among others. Aside from notions about intersectionality and equality and justice for all, our group doesn't really take much of an official stance on anything, because that's not what we're about. What we are about is trying to get a discussion going, and no good discussion ever happens when everyone agrees on everything. I always tell my members, you don't have to agree with each other, but you do have to respect each other. So since we started, we have faced some backlash from people that don't really understand what we're about. Even our student union isn't keen on giving us official status over the controversy of it all. I only wish that they would just come out to one of our meetings and see the people who attend them and the things that they have to say. I'd wager no one with an open mind would ever have a problem with us if they did. Ultimately, I just want to see a world where men don't have to feel like they can't speak out about the issues in their lives over fear of being seen as unmanly. Because who knows, we might save one or two of them from themselves. Anyways, I just want to thank you for having me, and yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't you say both together at the front for questions?
I'm just going to conclude and then say your course, and then, yeah, if there's questions, we'll gladly take them. I did want to say something quickly in conclusion because I didn't want to leave on a note of optimism. Over the last year and change, doing the work that I'm doing, I have seen some signs of improvement. I'll give you a few examples. So about a year and a half ago, right around the time we opened our center, 2 St. Joseph Hospital psychiatrists launched something called the Father's Health Network. This is specifically to address the mental health gaps for fathers. The Ottawa-based Men's Project and the Toronto-based Gatehouse, both agencies support male survivors of sexual assault. They've been around for a while, but they were joined on the scene just over the last couple of years by several new organizations that have popped up across the country dealing with other forms of trauma, including domestic violence that men face. The City of Toronto, a couple of years ago, began funding something called the Black Daddies Club, which is seeking to strengthen the father-child bond within the Black communities in Toronto. We have had, now again I'm speaking with respect to the center, we have had at least 24 requests from researchers conducting needs assessments for proposed men's programs or studying the experiences of boys and men. In fact, one of the Humanist Canada board members, Dr. Lloyd Robertson, is not the Dr. Robertson, I need to point out, is conducting qualitative research at Athabasca University into the effects of stigma on Canadian males and negative experiences male individuals have due to stereotyping. That's the research project that he's been granted approval to conduct. We were pleased to see that and to pass out a notice for folks to participate in that. And over the last few months, there's also been some interest that I haven't seen before from the mainstream media and some other unlikely sources related to men's issues. So, for example, critics were quick to point out that the government's decision to reject single male Syrian refugees was problematic, including none other than NDP leader Thomas Mulcair, who wrote a piece in the Huffington Post, quote, "Lone Syrian men should be excluded from refugee plans." Several researchers, including the UBC political science professor, Adam Jones in Vancouver, asked in a series of articles why Indigenous boys and men are not being included into the new inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous girls and women. And after the Ryerson Men's Issues Association was blocked, we had columnists like Martin Patriquin writing in Maclean's about the, quote, "frustrating tendency to banish all things distasteful," while Robin Urbach in the National Post wondered, quote, "why exactly is it okay to discriminate against men's groups on campus? Never seen anything like that before." So ours is a positive and a progressive message. The old adage, "take it like a man," must give way to a modern understanding that all of us can suffer. The failure to adequately address the health and well-being of boys and men profoundly affects everyone, back to the zero-sum game, or the opposite of that, I suppose, that Kevin was speaking of. Because all of us have men in our life who at one time or another have been in need of support, and it's of course affected all of us. I think we're going to make progress in this area when we understand that gender equality is not a zero-sum game, but rather that the failure to adequately address the health and well-being needs of boys and men profoundly affects everyone, including women. All of us have men who need support, and if we work together, we can close the existing gap in social services, we can make our communities more peaceful than they are, and our families more healthy than they are. And if we do that, then the benefits will be felt by all of us. That is obviously a very long-term project, but what we're trying to do is to deal with one particular piece of the puzzle that has tended to be ignored and not adequately addressed up until now. So thank you for your attention, and if there are questions, as George says, yes, we're happy to address them.